All right, we might kick off. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nicole Palavicini, and I'm a managing principal within the Marsh Cyber team here in Australia. Over the last few weeks, we have reflected on the cyber risk landscape, both in Australia and globally, and considered the implications that cyber risks ultimately have on board members. We've also looked at the considerations and implications of supply chain risk, the anatomy of a cyber breach, and just recently we undertook a session regarding understanding measuring your cyber risk exposure. So thank you for all those people who have attended our earlier sessions. For those who haven't attended, there is a replay that will be available following each session. A few housekeeping comments that I might just make is you may note that the session was scheduled for 90 minutes. We are going to give you all some time back in your day and keep this to an hour. And there's also a Q&A function box below should you have any questions for the panel members throughout the session. I'm very excited today to be joined by John Moran and Bill from Coveware. We've also got a special guest appearance today, which is Reese, who will also be joining the conversation today. I might just hand over to John to kick off and introduce himself and his team, and then we'll hand over to Bill.
Thanks, Nicole, and a big thank you from everybody here at Clyde & Co to Marsh for inviting us along, and congratulations on the success of your Cyber Risk Masterclass. We've tuned in for all of the sessions so far, so really great content and very timely. To introduce myself, for those who don't know me, my name is John Moran, and I lead up the Cyber Incident Response practice at Clyde & Co. We're the largest dedicated incident response team of any law firm in Australia and APAC, and we're very proud to partner with Marsh in relation to this seminar. And I'm very pleased to introduce Reese Corbett-Wilkins, who is one of the senior team members from our Sydney team, who'll also be joining in on the presentation today. And Bill, over to you for a bit of an introduction.
Sure, thank you so much, John, and thank you to the Marsh team and Clyde & Co for having me on this. Really thrilled and honored and flattered all around to be included, and looking forward to sharing our perspective and experience on this space. But just as a real quick background, Coveware is an incident response firm. We specialize in a really narrow area of these incidents, principally around handling negotiations on behalf of victims of cyber extortion, dealing with encryption and decryption issues, dealing with data exfiltration issues, and helping companies think through and craft strategies on how to navigate their recovery from these types of incidents.
Great, thanks very much. Obviously, big thanks to Marsh for having both of you join the panel discussion today. So just highlighting the agenda here, we're going to discuss the ransomware landscape, where we'll talk about the current environment that organisations within Australia are dealing with. We'll walk you through the demand, and we'll discuss what it looks like, how it can be identified, and what's next. A really important and topical thing that we're experiencing at the moment is whether or not we should be engaging or don't engaging. So Clyde & Co will walk us through the decision-making framework that organisations will need to go through in order to address whether or not they should be engaging with the threat actors. Part 4 will be the ransom negotiation, and we'll take you through the various stages of the negotiation and show you real-life snippets of each negotiation. And then part 5 will open up a discussion to Q&A. Obviously, we have suggested that there's a Q&A function, and if there is a relevant question, we will interject and answer that at the right time. So just kicking off from the ransomware landscape, I mean, ransomware continues to dominate the global headlines. More importantly, here in Australia, we have seen more targeted attacks on individual businesses, particularly in relation to critical infrastructure. This approach has certainly changed over the course of the past 12 months. Historically, it used to be a real scattergun approach to ransomware distribution that used to be used by the common threat actors. So what's driving this change individual businesses are now succumbing to the payment of ransom demands, highlighting that ransomware is becoming more sophisticated and more attractive to the threat actors given the high returns. This masterclass is going to delve into the threat actors and how they steal data, but we might also touch on some relevant issues in relation to OFAC sanctions and whether or not to pay for state nation threat actors. Highlighted here on the slide is an interesting snapshot around the ransomware payments. CrowdStrike has recently released a report, and according to them, over 67% of Australian organisations have dealt with a ransom in the last 12 months. This surpasses the global average of 57%. That's quite big for Australian organisations. And from a broking perspective, we have certainly noticed the uptick in ransom events occurring across our portfolio. The report also revealed that 33% of companies hit by ransom attacks have paid the ransom. This costs on average $1.2 million for each breach. And this is higher than any other country in the Asia Pacific region and more than the global average of 27%. So I think I might just pause there and hand over to Reese, who's going to walk us through the evolution of ransomware.
Great, thanks Nicole, and thanks for having me on. I suppose it would be tempting to think that ransomware itself is a new phenomenon because we're obviously hearing so much about it in the news and particularly mainstream media. But what I want to talk about today is just a little bit about the history and then also give some context to what we're going to discuss today. So we take a step back and just think about this as a form of financial crime. Holding somebody or something ransom for something is not a modern crime, and neither is ransomware a modern cybercrime. Ransomware itself, which is a form of malware, coupled with a threat to pay money in return for something, usually decryption keys or data that's been taken. That form of ransomware has actually been around since as early as 1989, the birth of modern computing, with the launch of the first ransomware campaign known as the AIDS campaign, which is at the time playing on the fears of what was for the public a real world health issue. And to paint the picture, at the time, the ransomware was distributed by the person sending out floppy disks with the computer virus embedded on the floppy disk to be inserted into the computer. So very clearly a different way of distributing that to these days. However, these days, ransomware, much like other computer viruses, we move away from what was hacktivist activity, which is effectively disgruntled, usually technology proficient individuals trying to make a political or social statement. That was really the genesis of a lot of this malicious activity. If we fast forward from those days to 2010 and 2015, that period, we're really talking about what we're calling ransomware version 2.0. And what changed over that period was criminals and organized crime really saw technology assisted crime as a way of making serious money. And we started to see the birth of financially motivated cybercrime as being a very viable opportunity to make money as part of criminal enterprise. In this early era, businesses around the world and in Australia started to get hit by what was called crypto locker style ransomware, which encrypted data and shut down networks. One of the main types of ransomware at this time was called crypto wall. And for the first time, target organizations were able to pay the extortion through Bitcoin, which then itself was only 4 years old, a form of cryptocurrency. And I've gone back through the records, and at that point, Bitcoins, by the way, were worth $600 each. They're now worth about $25,000 each. So we clearly all missed the boat in buying Bitcoin back then. At about that time, mainstream cyber policy started to hit the Australian market, and that's where you started to see insurers come into the field to really start to help organizations insure against the costs and the risks of these types of incidents. However, take up of insurance was slow as the perceived risk of being hit by ransomware was low. That perception, though, started to change throughout that era. And as we move from 2014 into 2019, which is last year, we started to see that ransomware itself started to make its way around the wild, with some very notable examples such as GandCrab and other global events such as WannaCry and NotPetya in 2017, which I think most people are familiar with, as it cost the industry billions of dollars around the world of damage. By this stage, this notion of ransomware as a service was starting to kick off. And what that is cybercrime organizations joining together to be able to actually carry out their criminal enterprise. And what you saw was a bunch of different organizations joining together in a supply chain of criminal activity. You had threat actor groups who were very good at being able to actually identify vulnerabilities in organizations' networks, joining with groups who were able to actually get into the network and scan it and identify the assets and the backups and the data. You had another group who were able to get in and actually deploy ransomware. Then you had another group who were there to actually negotiate the ransomware, facilitate the payment. And then last but not least, you have a group that provided that after-sales service to ensure that you actually got what you paid for. So you're really starting to see this supply chain deepen. But critically for this group, the ransomware payments were about $2,000 to $250,000. And to Nicole's point earlier, it really was a scattergun approach. We started to see a lot of victims, but we started to see them easily wash through. We're starting to see now what we're calling ransomware version 3.0, which is this year's activities, and it's a whole new face. Late last year in North America and as early as start of this year in Australia, we started to see a different type of breed of ransomware activity where we moved from encryption to data exfiltration and extortion. And that hybrid style of risk is where we started to see criminal organizations really start to make money by not only encrypting your systems and bringing you to your knees, but actually extorting you by threatening to publish data that they're taken on their way out before they had deployed the ransom malware. Just as a bit of a forecasting, because this year, that's been the headlines all year, people have asked us already, is this going to end? When is this going to end? Is it going to get worse? Is it going to get better? I think the answer is it's going to be stable and for a long time. We've already got some very well-known groups such as Soda and Nakobe who have said that they're out to make $1 billion worth of profit before they hang up their shoes and call it a day. And they're currently saying that they're only making about $100 million a year. So there's $900 million to go just for that one group. And so the question really will be, how long will they be able to take this action to be able to make that money? What is government going to do to be able to stop this? What is industry going to do to stop this? And critically, how do insurers fit in that piece to help educate consumers and corporates around responding to this risk and preparing for it? Thanks, Nicole. Back to you.
Thanks, Reece. I think you've made some really good points there, and certainly really important for our clients that are on this call to really consider the risk mitigation tools that organisations should have in place to try and prevent the increase in severity and frequency of these ransomware demands. We are going to now go into the next phase, and we're going to have a look at what a demand itself actually looks like and how the organisation receives this and what to actually make of them. So John, do you think you can talk us through what we're going to see here on the next slide?
Yeah, happy to, Nicole. That's a great introduction from Reece, a great backdrop to modern day ransomware. Just to give you a bit of an insight to the brief for this session, we've avoided going into in depth on all the elements of incident response. This is really a very focused and targeted look at ransomware. In preparing for this, I had a bit of a think back on some of the debrief sessions that we've had with Marsh clients and with Marsh on some of the incidents that we've managed. And the key thing that shines through in the feedback we get from clients around the benefit of the service and what they found helpful from the support that they received from Marsh and from Clyde & Co. and from vendors like Coveware is that we were able to roll out a process for that client to help guide them through this incident. And many people will be familiar with the idea of incident response plans. Many people will be familiar with the incident with playbooks. What we're trying to do today is not necessarily give you a formula as to or set out a prescribed path how to deal with this, but rather to give you an indication of how these incidents tend to flow. I should say as well that no two incidents are the same. No two incidents will respond in the same way. But this issue of dealing with this demand and stepping through a decision-making framework is the bedrock of dealing with ransomware. There's a whole other presentation that we could deliver on the security aspects, a whole other presentation we could deliver on the operational aspects, and some of those topics have been really helpfully covered by Marsh during this masterclass. But what we're really focusing on today is, what does a business most typically feel? What are the questions they have to ask themselves? What are the questions they have to answer when they are presented with this demand? So without too much more further ado, I'm going to walk you through the demand. So hopefully for those who are joining on the laptop, they can see this demand nice and clear. And for those on your phone, feel free to bring it right up to your face. We can't see you, it's okay. This is an exact replica or a copy of a demand that we are in fact currently dealing with. It's from one particular group. I'm going to take a minute or two just to walk you through this because it will be fresh to some of you. It is probably one of the most daunting things you will see when you're in fact an impacted organization. This may be presented either through you trying to open a file and getting a pop-up with this screen, or in fact it might be emailed through to you if you're a senior executive in the business, or it might just be on your screen when you go to log in. But if we work our way through the demand from the top left corner, making our way around, you are being told that your documents and databases and other important files belonging to the business have been encrypted. If you move along, you're being told that in order to decrypt these files, you're going to require some specialist software. In other words, don't try and do this yourself. And very helpfully, they're providing you very clear and detailed instructions on what you need to do, how much time you have to do that. And then interestingly for this demand, which is not always the case, we're being provided with an upfront price. We're also being told what that price will increase to after the timer ends, and you're being told what your timer in fact is. You're also being given a Bitcoin address. I should flag that the demands vary. The way they're presented, the content of the demand changes quite frequently, and Bill is going to walk us through that in a couple of minutes' time. The piece that I'd probably, or the note that I'd probably ask everybody to take away is that it's becoming more frequent that the price is not in fact disclosed up front because the threat actor groups wants you to engage. I'm going to move on to that in 1 second.
Can I just ask a question there, John? Sorry. I see that you've got 4 days to make the payment. I mean, is that the average duration of an incident when it comes to ransom, or, can we, think it might be 8 weeks? Is there any statistic out there that says it's typically going to take 4 days to overcome this issue?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I'll throw this to Dylan in 1 sec. But just to frame that, I think it's safe to say that we have never had an incident where we're in and we're out within 4, 5, 6 days. Unfortunately, Nicole, as you know very well, a lot of our clients live through this process for a long time, even when decisions are made to deal with this issue up front, or in fact not to deal with it. It has got a tail. These incidents have got a tail, and for the reasons we're going to set out today, it's not just about security. It's not just about decryption. It becomes privacy related. It becomes communications focused. It becomes reputational risk focused. And we'll walk on to it. We'll move on to this in 2 seconds with Bill. But Bill and Cove are able to provide some really specialist and focused knowledge when it comes to the likely length of having to deal with these demands. I should just flag up front as well that it's a really good point you pick up on in relation to the 4-day piece. The key leverage, and for those who have had the misfortune of having to speak to me before in a real life incident will know that I say this up front, the real leverage that a threat actor group has against an organization at this point in time is time. Time will improve an insured's or an organization's position. So the more time you have, the more work, the more investigations, the more things that you can do to better your position. Because of that, the threat actor groups apply a maximum amount of pressure. They quite literally have a clock running to try and get you to make a decision. And I'm going to walk you through what that decision is, what they're looking for you to do in two seconds. But I might just move along to the next slide, just to contextualize this a little bit more. So you've just seen what the demand looks like. Very frequently, we are also provided as part of that demand a link to a dark web page. In this instance, it's called a happy blog. There is absolutely nothing happy about it. In this instance, we are being told, or we're being informed that documentation and data has been taken, and a large leak of that data will occur if the ransom amount is not paid within a certain amount of time. It might provide some more information in relation to that data. It might provide file paths. It might provide samples of the data. But essentially, it is, albeit it is a hidden web page. Typically, it is not made public until the threat actors decide to make it public to up the leverage. It is there as a warning, a very clear warning that data has been taken to try and up the ante. So that hopefully contextualizes a little bit more about what businesses are most frequently presented with when it comes to the demand. Bill, was there anything that you wanted to add on either the demand or the happy blog? Any observations from you?
Yeah, maybe if we could go back to the initial page. There's kind of a few things to point out, and one of the reasons that it's important to work with firms like Clyde & Co. and Marsh that have a lot of experience with this is that while this all looks pretty straightforward and you can read through it, there's actually quite a bit of nuance to what's going on this page. And so kind of working from the top to bottom, you'll notice there's it says right in the middle, it's partially blacked out. There's this 2Y6 decryptor price, and it says underneath that's for all the PCs in your network. So for this specific type of ransomware, sometimes they actually separate their demands on a per machine basis, and sometimes they ask for a lump sum price. And so what they're actually saying by saying this is the price for all the PCs is that they're trying to sell you a universal tool. But there are different versions of this page, which is a Sodinokibi page, that would be slightly different. And so it's important to be able to recognize those things. The other thing is while we're looking at the timer, you'll notice that it looks like it just flipped over from the 24-hour mark, right? Someone took a screenshot of this, right? 23 hours, 58 minutes. And what that tells you is that this was the first time that this page was likely opened, because these pages, for the folks that have done this a bunch of time, are triggered, and that timer is triggered the first time the page is opened. And so one thing that we look at when we first access these sites is, was the timer already triggered? Because that would mean that someone else actually logged in and potentially did something somewhere. And that timer might have wound down 2 days without us even knowing. So it's important to actually figure out what happened. The other thing is that the demand actually floats. These pages are actually rigged to update with the current price of cryptocurrency every 4 hours. And so the numbers on this will actually change periodically. And that's also critically important, that if you actually have to go down the negotiation and payment path, you need to know to actually instruct the threat actor to freeze the cryptocurrency amount. Otherwise, it will change and you'll pay them the wrong amount, which will start the process over again. So a lot of nuance behind a bunch of the different areas here, and why it's super important to engage experienced outside counsel when you are presented with a demand like this.
Thanks, Bill. We've just got a question here, and it's quite an interesting one. I'm just going to read it out. I'm curious purely on the practical nature of Happy Blog. They claim to have taken data. I know that in conversations with leadership, they want to explore all options. My question is there any way hackers can validate that the data is deleted? My understanding is no, because you are having to trust them with that. As a follow-up, have you seen payments sent and hackers release the data and swing back and try a second extortion? There's a lot in that question.
There is a lot in that. You go, Bill, you lead.
Sure. So I guess on the first part about, can we put any faith in the credibility of the threat actors deleting information? So we put out some pretty strong literature a couple of weeks back on this very point, because and it's a nuanced point. There's two parts of cyber extortion, as Reese mentioned earlier. You can get extorted for a decryption key to actually recover your data, and you can get extorted for the non-proliferation or non-release of stolen data, and they're two very different things. And the main difference is with a decryption key, once you have that key, right? If you have to pay for that key and you get the key, they can't take it back. It doesn't degrade. It doesn't expire. It will always work on your encrypted data if it's the correct key. And so you can measure, the default and the efficacy of that decryption, and trust that once you actually get that key, you can take those statistics to the bank. And if they repeat themselves over and over and over again, then they can be pretty, you can rely on those when you're making decisions. One of the things that our firm and Clyde & Co trying to bring to bear in these incidents is bringing past data into the decision-making process so that we're not guessing. Now, the difference with data exfiltration is there's no way to know. And more importantly, the passage of time, you don't, just because they don't post the data a day later, a week later, a month later, doesn't mean that they might not post it 2 months later, or they might not extort you 3 months later. And the groups that are doing this, it's a pretty short track record, right? It's less than a year. It's not like we have 10 years to look back on and say, well, it's been a decade and they haven't come back for more money, so I guess we can write this one off. It's a very short amount of time. And some of the behavior that we've witnessed is that some of these groups are getting big. This may sound strange, but some of these cyber criminal groups are getting big and they're fraying. Just like when any company or any organization grows too big and people leave and they get disgruntled. And we have had kind of lone wolf actors from most of the major ransomware groups reapproach victims and clients of ours that have paid with some subset snippet of the stolen data that our clients had paid for not to be proliferated. And lo and behold, they've got a copy. And so that's led us to really imprint on our clients to think about this in 3 ways. You need to make a decision about your brand. That's the company's decision. You need to make a decision about your legal liability and notifications, and that's a decision to make with your privacy counsel. And then there's a practical reality of what do you actually get when you pay? Yes, it is not. It is true that most of the time these groups don't put you right up on their happy blog, but that's about it, right? You cannot credibly audit the deletion of this information, and you have to really be vigilant over the weeks and months that follows to see if it's still circulating out there. So anyway, long answer to your short question.
But well addressed.
That's great, Nicole. I might just jump in there just to close that out. So if we come back to this scenario and we come back to what this company is facing right now, as we said, they have seen the demand. It's very likely that operationally they are impacted. We would expect that the company is already starting to look at their response options in terms of their security posture. Is it ongoing? Starting to bring in specialist vendors to look at this from a forensic perspective. Traditionally, our role at this point in time, and you would be part of that, Nicole, is to talk to the clients about how do they deal with this demand. So if we strip everything back, and if the only thing we look at is how do we deal with this demand, we typically find that clients will, not having gone through this before, they will jump ahead to the question of, do we pay, don't we pay, can we pay, should we pay? What we're going to take you through over the next couple of slides is that there are a series of questions that need to be answered and addressed by an organization before they get to that point in time. And these questions and these junctures, if you want to call them that, they are the critical steps in building the bedrock of making a decision around pay, don't, and pay that informs the entire strategy around the incident response. The key question, one of the key questions organizations will have is how much? How much are they asking us to pay? But really, when they take a bit more time to think through this, the real question that they have is what they should have at this point, or what they work towards is what data has been accessed, what data has been exfiltrated, if any. And after they work through a decision-making framework, they tend to come back to this point because that is the key information gap at this point in time. They don't know whether data has been taken. It is very likely that a forensic investigation or a security analysis at this point in time may take anywhere between 1 to 10 days to determine or validate whether data has in fact been exfiltrated and what that data looks like. So without that key information, we are unfortunately, as you'd expect me to say, we're back in the hands of the threat actor. We're back dealing with the threat and trying to tease out and validate that threat. So without much further ado, I think we'll keep moving, Nicole, because I'm stealing my own thunder. I'll throw back to you to introduce this next piece, Nicole.
Thanks very much. So we're going to now discuss the next steps in whether or not we should be engaging with the threat actor. So the organization has received the demand and they've seen their name appear on the website. Why don't we have a look now at what happens next? John and Bill, did you want to have a discussion around what organisations do at this stage to gather intel and information to help frame the decision in relation to whether or not they should be engaging with the threat actor?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in there, Nicole. And the reason I'm going to jump in there is because I'm going to pump Coveware's tires and Bill's and the great service they provide, because he may not do a good enough job of it himself. But typically, as I said, the questions the clients are asking right now are, who is this group? What intelligence can you provide? We work with Coveware every day of the week. It's literally a 24-hour service. We've dealt with more incidents than I care to recall with the Coveware. But critically, clients have questions. They want to know about this demand. They want to know about this group. And that's where the excellent service that Coveware provide comes into the piece and gives clients, in our experience, a lot of peace of mind, or at least a greater insight into what they might be dealing with. So at this point in time, we're trying to gain intelligence from that singular note that might have been presented, or the happy blog post. I might throw it to you, Bill, just to walk us through a little bit more about that and threat intelligence and your approach to that.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, it's just the attribution of the variant of ransomware and potentially the threat actor are important at this stage, because depending on the urgency and the criticality of the situation, it's going to the advice that we give on kind of next steps could materially differ. So, for instance, we had a client this week who had safely restored everything from backups, but had read about this data exfiltration trend and said, well, gosh, I'm worried about this. We have all these ransom notes still everywhere, and are we about to suffer a leak, and are we going to be on our heels? And it took us about 10 minutes to attribute the variant, and our statistics showed that they don't exfiltrate data. And so while we didn't perform forensic analysis, and we can't say definitively because we're not looking at their network, we did have a dozen cases that we had handled in the past 30 days, and none of those clients had experienced even the threat of data exfiltration, let alone the validation of it. And so we're able to tell them on that phone call, actually, you don't even need to engage us, right? We don't even need to sign contracts. If you're okay with these statistics, if you don't want to go any deeper, we think you're okay. So, one of the keys to getting through an incident is to minimize the variables. So let's not introduce this variable because we don't think it's material at this point. On the other hand, you could be faced with, a situation like is personified here, where you've got a ticking clock and you've got evidence of data exfiltration already presented to you, and you want to prevent that. In which case, you need to engage pretty quickly, because we'll say, oh, okay, well, that's Soden and they're nasty, and depending on the moon cycle, we could wake up in the morning and have 25 requests for comment from the media because they just got in a bad mood, decided to dump the data. So it is really important at this early stage to understand who you're dealing with and what the next 24 to 48 hours may look like, and then contextualize that with the situation and the urgency that the client has.
I might be jumping or getting a bit ahead of myself, so you can tell me to hold this question till later on in the discussion. But obviously, a key consideration from a cyber insurance perspective is whether or not these threat actors are sanctioned, and whether or not it's legal to make the payment. At what stage in this process would you advise the client on whether or not it's legal to make the payment?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in there, Bill, just to take that, and I'll weave into that how we interact with you. So it's a good question, Nicole, and off the back of the OFAC circular, for those who are familiar with it, and those who've been living under a stone, this is just one of the hottest topics when it comes to ransomware at the moment. And this question of, is it legal to pay? Do we fall foul of local or international anti-money laundering legislation, sanctions legislation? There's a whole raft of other tricky pieces of law around the world that intermingle with this question of pay, don't pay. That is one of the questions that a client will ask. And typically in that first 24-hour period, if you look at the timer, we're at that 24-hour mark. We know that we've got maybe a day or 1, 2, or 3 days left before the timer expires. Clients will be asking for advice around that. And at that point in time, while we're building our knowledge around this threat actor group, we typically are able to provide clients with a framework, at least a framework to think through these issues. It's unlikely that we have got absolute concrete and tangible evidence on this group to be able to run complete sanctions checks, but we are able to give a client enough insight to understand what the risks might be around that. I'm not going to go into the specifics of the advice because every case is going to be different on this, Nicole, but just suffice to say that it is it is probably the most upfront question that we're getting in our incident response dealing with ransomware at the minute. So as you say, in that 24-hour piece, we're looking at the question of legality, both from a local and international perspective. Just to keep moving through this slide as well, Nicole, which it is linked to your question, but just go back, sorry, to that previous slide. The other aspects that we might be talking to the business about is what is the impact that the encryption is having on operations. So for example, are all servers down, are critical systems down that prevent the delivery of services to clients? How long do we think it would take to do a wipe and rebuild? I'm not going to go into detail on that, but it is also one of the pieces of the puzzle that businesses need to figure out, not only from a business operations perspective, but also from a monetary perspective to understand when you know more about the demand, is that a price that perhaps you might be willing to pay to stem the losses from a business impact perspective. If we just keep moving around the circle, as I said earlier on, a lot of clients run or rush towards this concept of pay, don't pay. And as you said, Nicole, the sanctions piece is a huge component of that. But critically, the first question that we're asking clients about at this stage is, do you engage? Do you begin to talk to the threat actor? Do you begin a negotiation process? And one of the key reasons that we're raising that at this point is because that is your first step. It's not about whether you pay or you don't pay. The question is, do you begin a negotiation? And do you take the risks? And are you fully informed as to the risks, the pros and the cons of engaging with the threat actor group at that point in time? And I should say that there are many, and they will be specific to particular clients. They'll be specific to particular industries, and they'll be specific to that threat actor group that you're dealing with. And that is where, with the covert service and the service we provide, probably is at its most intense with the client. We are talking to them about really, they're at a fork in the road, and they need to decide whether they're going to continue this engagement with the threat actor, or start an engagement with the threat actor, or whether they're going to go their own way and just knuckle down and go through a rebuild process and prepare for what's coming. I might just keep moving on, Bill, because we're going to come on to the next slide, which touches a little bit more on our interaction. So just to recap, we've done a bit of a review of the demand, and you've heard from Bill. We're starting to build a picture about that threat actor and what a business can expect in terms of intelligence about past behavior with that threat actor group. And having spoken to the client, in this instance, we've taken the decision that they will engage covert, and they decide that they will proceed with a negotiation of the threat actor. There's no decision at this point in time to pay, and that is typically the case. Businesses often go into a negotiation understanding that they may not ultimately end up paying. But Bill, I'd be interested to hear your views on how frequently you see clients enter a negotiation knowing that they will not pay, and what your views are on that.
Yeah, so it's actually becoming a lot more common. And we were actually just talking about this internally today, because we were looking at the active matters that we're managing, and it was like a material portion of them were actually what we call faux negotiation, like fake fur, fake negotiations. And the reason we carry these out are a couple-fold. There's a lot of situations where clients are able to recover, but they just need time, right? They don't want to have to feel pressured to rush through a forensic analysis. They need time to put their statements together and craft a notification, customers, partners, regulators, the public, their employees. They don't want to rush through that. And while they have zero intention of paying, we still end up engaging. And what we will do is we will engage with the threat actor with kind of two goals. Number one, to buy time. And number two, to extract further intelligence to hopefully augment the forensic investigation and what the client knows about what happened. So we'll actually engage with the threat actor, and it will look and feel to the threat actor like a bona fide, earnest negotiation with, counterpoints and counter offers, and well, it doesn't seem that material, and we got to show some more information if you really want us to pay more, and we'll drag these things out for a week, 2 weeks sometimes, and during that period of time, we're able to pick up more intelligence about what happened, which helps forensics, and the company is able to get their footing and effect a recovery, get their business back up and running, get all their statements and everything organized, knowing full well that this is going to end, because these things end in one of two ways: you either pay them or they release and leak the data. But that leak is going to come. But when it does come, we're going to be able to forecast when it happens, and we're going to be ready. And we're not going to be surprised by it. And those two things are important for any large enterprise. The ability to forecast and be ready for what happens is critically important for any aspect of the business, let alone recovering from an incident.
That's some really good points. I'd be interested, if you're going through these negotiations for 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, this must be quite fatiguing on clients and the key stakeholders within the business, the board members, company secretaries, the IT team. I mean, how do you manage that fatigue? And how do clients persevere with this ongoing negotiations, updating of, advice in relation to making payment and things like that?
John, you want to take that
good
first?
Question. I'll happy to jump in there, Bill. It's a really good question, Nicole, and it's one of the key pieces of advice that we give to our clients up front is that not just for the team dealing with the negotiation or dealing with the media strategy or looking at the data risk assessment, all businesses or all components of that team will need to prepare for that fatigue, prepare that this has got a tail. These incidents can go on for weeks, they can go on for months. And all the while, the business is trying to continue to service its clients. So just preparing for that, preparing for teams to rotate, taking breaks when they can, understanding or passing over control of a negotiation to somebody else, and actually factoring in downtime in these weeks. It's the first thing we talk to clients about in terms of structuring their team and rotating people. It is exhausting. It is can be with them for a very long time, and there's a huge amount of stress and anxiety associated with dealing with this. We, as a firm, we try to make things as easy as we can for clients. So we, it's not just about giving long piece of advice. It's about making things short and snappy. It's having stand-up calls. It's using alternative ways of communicating. It's also about having making light where you can, and actually having good people surround you in the process, and trying to make sure that the team is operating well. Bill, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, to echo that, the Hippocratic oath of incident response is don't make matters worse, and there's a real fast way to make matters worse, and that's to have your team be dehydrated, malnourished, and sleep deprived, because the material mistakes will get made. So preparing for what ends up being a marathon is important, and the physical and the mental health of the team that's doing it is critically important, because if their brains don't work, they're going to make mistakes.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm conscious of time. I mean, this has just flown. So John, why don't we walk through the little speech bubbles quickly and give the audience a bit more of a flavor around how the negotiations unfold.
Yeah, I'm going to tag team with Reese on this next piece, so we might just scoot ahead 2 slides. So as you say, Nicole, we're under pressure, which is fitting for real life scenarios. So what we've taken here is some of the snapshots of the negotiations. They're played around with ever so slightly, but to give you a snapshot into some of the back and forth that together with the client, together with Marsh, together with the Clyde & Co team and Cove, where the interactions that we might have with the threat actor group. So Reese, I might let you drive, and Bill, I think you're going to chip in with some of the intelligence behind the interactions.
Yeah, great. Thanks, John. So we're going to go through, again, as John said at the outset, there's a process to everything. So when you actually get to the point now where you're engaging with a threat actor, Again, no decision yet to pay. We're just going to go through the key processes of that negotiation. So you can see here that we're in phase 1, the initial contact with the threat actor. You can see here that the threat actor has sent a note. Usually it's either an email reach out or it could be on their leaked website if you've reached out to them that way. But they've effectively set the ground rules for the negotiation. In broken English, they say the type of files we download you can see on our website. The ransom for you is 225 Bitcoins. When this ransom is paid, we will send you a decryption tool and securely delete all the files we've downloaded. We will also tell you how we got into your network and give you advice on how to bolster your cybersecurity. Companies that pay us will never be targeted by us again. And if you pay us and manage to keep things quiet on your end, which will never be known to the public. So a bit of broken English there, but you can see here the key tenets. The ground rules are there. They've got something to give you. They've got a valid threat that if you don't pay, they will publish data that they've taken. They've got something to negotiate. So Bill, I might stand up to you. What's your initial thoughts when you see this? Is there anything that pops out straight away?
So these initial responses, we actually use these for a portion of our intelligence because they tend to be templated. They tend to just be copies and paste, and maybe one thing is changed, and that's the price. So we tend to not read into really anything that they're saying because it's the same thing every single time, and we actually use these templates to identify that, like, if there's we know the variant, but sometimes there's different actual affiliates or actors that are running the negotiation process. And so we'll look at these templated responses because they can vary from affiliate to affiliate, or even between the chat operators. And we'll say, okay, based on this, it's this one. And now we have kind of a subset of cases within the variant to go back and say, okay, well, this person's a real night owl, so don't talk to them during these hours because they're crabby and they haven't had their coffee. But you can actually make more progress in the negotiation in the nighttime hours. So that we actually tend to kind of read through these things for more intelligence that'll help craft strategy.
Super. Why don't we go to the next slide? So again, phase 2, we've reached out. Blue is us, or Coveware. Hello, can you send us some files that you've stolen from us? And then they respond, in the attachment, there is a file listing and a few files from that listing. This is proof we have your files. So just coming back to John's point earlier on, you've now, and to Bill's point earlier on, you've now reached out to them for the purpose of intelligence gathering, and you've clearly achieved one piece of intel, which is they are saying they've got your files, and they've been able to prove and validate that by giving that back to you for you to review yourself. So again, Bill, what are you learning from this? Why are you asking this question head on?
Sure. So especially as it relates to data exfiltration, there are groups that bluff. They'll threaten it in the ransom note. They'll threaten it in the first response. And sometimes you'll reach out and say, it says you took our data here, prove it to us. And they say something like, we'll prove it to you when we leak it all to the media. And you're like, okay, well, you still have to prove it to us, right? So they do have to validate these things, right? There's a lot of similarities between cyber extortion and the traditional kidnap and ransom space, right? No one would ever pay a ransom to release a loved one unless you got, proof of life. And so they need to prove these things to us. And so we'll also be looking for exactly what they're sending us, right? We had a recent case where they sent us back some files and we shared them with a client, and they happened to be a municipality, and they said, yeah, these are our files, but guess what? You can download them on our website. So it doesn't prove anything. We need to dig deeper.
That's helpful. And back to John's point earlier, we said we weren't going to talk today about all the other work streams that happen in parallel, like your privacy assessment, your data risk assessment, but just to flag that this intelligence is feeding into multiple work streams and multiple business units to start to assess your overall response. Again, we're just focused on the negotiation. All right, next slide. Okay, so Bill writes back, we've obviously got validation of files, so we think they've got something to offer us. Bill writes back, to think that we have $9 million USD to pay you is impossible, ... And they write back, this is business. We do not need your files. And in addition, the reputation of our company confirms that we will have fulfilling all conditions of this transaction. Bill, what are your thoughts on this?
All right, so hard to understand what they're saying, right? But what they're basically saying is, we don't care about your files, and we have a good reputation, so you should trust us. That's what they're actually saying in the sentence there. So this is them kind of positioning the, like, hey, trust us. Look at our, look at our site, look at all the companies that we posted on, read all about us. We always provide the decryption key. They are actually trying to validate themselves as a trustworthy counterparty, as crazy as that sounds.
Yep. I'm going to have some commentary between here and the next slide. So in terms of this scenario, what organizations at this point typically do, and whether it's in a few days or even a couple of weeks, if they are deciding to pay, this is where they really start to barter on the price and really understanding what are you buying in consideration for the price. And that's where, if I'm honest, to pump up Bill's tires, the team does phenomenally well. If you're going to negotiate with these people, you want someone who has experience with this group to critically, at minimum, reduce the price at which you're going to pay. And on average, we've worked with Bill to get a discount of up to 70% off the face value of the demand. If we go to the next slide. So the question there is, how are we supposed to pay with the cryptocurrency that law enforcement around the world has started to impose bans on? And the threat actor says, I think I will make an exception for you and activate the opportunity to accept payment in Bitcoins. In this case, it was initially Monero, which is effectively an outlawed form of currency because you can't validate who receives it. They then say Bitcoin activated. The Bitcoin is 683 Bitcoins. Now, obviously, this is a different negotiation, but you see that that's the process. Bill, I'll come back to you on the last one just to say that this is the point now where, as John said right at the outset, you need to get that sanctions check up and running. You need to start looking at this question early on about can you pay? Because ultimately, if an organization gets to a point where they decide to pay, if you haven't got that sanctions clearance, if it comes back negative, you just can't make the payment. So you really need to get your ducks in line to be able to make it if that's where you get to. And of course, to Nicole's point earlier around insurers, you also need to get insurers on board that journey right at the outset because they themselves will have their own considerations as well.
I was just going to go to the next slide. Oh, sorry, Nick. If you don't mind, just back on the slide earlier, you mentioned that Codeware has the ability to reduce the demand by anywhere between 60 and 70%. I mean, that must be huge in some situations and is obviously, from an insurance perspective, beneficial for insurers when you're determining reasonableness in relation to the payment of the ransom. So that's a great point that you mentioned. That's all. Carry on.
And coupled with the fact that Bitcoins have doubled in price over the last month. So, not even 5 years ago, if last month we'd all invested Bitcoins, we wouldn't be here. So there you go. If we go to the last slide. So this is really where you're trying to wrap up the tail end of the negotiation and be really clear on what you're actually purchasing. Here are a list of demands that clients typically ask for. Clearly, you've got the decryption tool. To get the systems back up and running quickly. You've got a deletion log, which to the questionnaire, I think, asked that question about what you can expect from an outcome. We've talked about that. Clearly, organizations ask never to be targeted again, including subsidiaries and other related group entities. We ask for a list of files, and critically, that's so you can assess data risk in tandem with the forensics. And then lastly, confirmation that the data has not been passed around. So Bill, just quickly to wrap up that, what are your thoughts on that kind of laundry list of demand expectations and how does that play out with your experience?
Yeah, so this is kind of correctly stacked rank as well as in order of trust and conviction that you'll actually get these things and what they're actually worth, right? So as we talked about earlier, we tend to have a high degree of conviction in the repeatability of the statistics about getting the decryption keys and the efficacy of those. So we tend to say you can by and large you should be able to trust these statistics in case unless something goes horribly wrong, right? But then things tend to degrade as you get down this list, right? Between threat actor groups, some threat actor groups are almost always give you deletion logs and file trees. Other groups are like 50-50. Other groups, when they'll agree to it, and then a day later they'll be like, "We deleted your data. What are you worried about? Buzz off," and you don't get it. So it's important to know that that is the expectation because it does vary from ransomware group to ransomware group. The not getting targeted again, kind of nice to ask for. You obviously can't prove it, and with the kind of commonality of how vulnerabilities and credentials are shared these days, it's likely that more than one group was probably trying to get into the organization originally, and then kind of lastly, confirmation that no one else has had custody of the data. Basically impossible to audit.
I'm curious as to whether or not a demand, the list of demands would incorporate, keeping the payment of the ransom actually confidential, because I know a number of people or clients that we speak to, they're obviously very anxious and nervous that it's going to get exposed, that the payment's going to be actually made. So I'm quite surprised not to see it listed here to keep the payment confidential.
Yeah, so it's kind of a standard, the non-proliferation of the data, non-posting of the data is typically included in this list. It's kind of that's like a standard known. We typically list it out, but it's more like a tacit understanding that this is not going to go anywhere. But this also highlights one of the pitfalls of ransomware as a service. Going back to that original slide, that was actually of a Tor site. And in a Sodinokibi attack, there could be several thousand of those Tor sites, and they're mirrored, meaning anybody that has a copy of the note can visit it. And so you have to be very careful in these attacks to corral where these notes go, make sure no employees send them to their friends that are journalists, make sure that no one in IT uploads one to VirusTotal or AnyRun, which are essentially public sites, whether they'll be found by security researchers. So having that information not get out, it actually more often inadvertently leaked by the company than by the threat actor.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. That's super interesting. Back to you, Nick. We've whizzed through that in
record time, which leaves me with 1 minute to spare. There have been a few questions that have come through the Q&A function. I would ask each of you to reach out to your Marsh client account manager or the Marsh Cyber Pacific team, and we would happily address any further questions that you might have in relation to ransom. So just closing today's session, obviously a big thanks to Bill, John and Reese for joining us today. I mean, I have gone through a ransom process with some of my clients, but even still throughout this discussion, I've learned more points and observations that I can help clients through. So your advice has been very insightful. So thank you very much, team. And this now concludes the Marsh Masterclass series. So we would like to obviously extend our warm thanks to everyone that has undertaken this journey with us. We hope that you have taken away some key learnings from each and every single series to enable you to prepare for what is to come in 2021 as the cyber risk landscape continues to unfold. So thank you all very much for your time and have a great day.